So we've just gotten started doing a little bit of converting here from what started as more imperative style, changing it over to be a more functional style. We did that with these two functions here, load beers and setActiveFilter. And now we're going to take it a step further and transfer or convert the filtering that's done down here. So let's take a look at how we're doing it now in the imperative style. We're repeating the same for loop. So if you remember, wherever we're repeating code, it's a really good candidate for replacing with a function. So you can see we're doing the same for loop over the beers list, and then we're checking to see, in each case, if a certain key on each beer object matches a certain value. So this should be a place where we can write a function to do this filtering for us. So let's go back up here where we're defining our functions at the top, and we'll do filter beers, and we're going to take the property and the value. Let's just go ahead and copy the domestic case. And I'll actually cut that out of there. And we'll just swap out a few things, okay? So we can go ahead and just use the global beers because we're getting it up here now, okay? So we have access to it in the scope. We'll talk later about whether or not that's a good idea, but for now we're just going to leave that alone. And so we're looping over that. And here we're hard coding the check against this locale property. And so instead we want to use bracket notation to swap in whatever the value of property is. And then we don't want to check it against a hard-coded string. We want to actually check it against the passed-in value. And so we need to actually create our filtered beers array and pass it back. We'll push onto it if it matches the criteria, and then we'll return. So now we have a working filter beers function. Let's just try it with domestic. So filtered beers. Now in this scope, because again we're inside this function here, this anonymous function. So we have this empty array filtered beers, and we're going to set it to be the result of our filter beers function that we just created. The property is locale, and the value we care about here is domestic. And let's refresh the page, and we'll get all of our beers back. And clicking on domestic still does the filtering the way we want. We haven't broken anything else. So if we start to replace this, all right, so here's imports, that's works. So here we want to know if type equals IPA or if type equals ale. So our function doesn't handle this case yet. So we need to do a little bit of modification to make sure our filter can adapt to whatever we want here. Let's take a look. My first thought is to just check right here and see if this is an array. So we can use array.isArray, and that'll tell us if value is an array. But what if it is? Well, now we actually have to do another for loop and then do an if statement inside that. This function is getting to be pretty crazy and complicated. So using this declarative style, I'm thinking maybe what we need to do is instead of this kind of hard-coded property check, what if we created another function that did the comparison for us? Instead of doing this check, we'll just do if compare values. We'll pass it the beer that we're on, that current object, and the property, and the value. And that should take this information and convert it into a true or false to see if the criteria match the way we want them to. So down here we can create a new function, compare values, which takes a beer, or in this case we could even make it a little more generic and say an item, a property, and a value. Now if it's not an array, then we can just return, does the item property equal the value? And that's our old case. So everything up to now should work. And then what we have to do is now solve for the case where it is an array. So otherwise, since we've already returned here, we don't even have to do an else. We can just say otherwise we'll loop over, remember value is an array there, even though it's still called value. And now for each of these, we'll check item property against value, but now instead of the array itself, we'll actually get the item that we're on. So if there's an array of values there, we want to check each individual one. And if any of them are true, we will return true. And otherwise, the end here, we can return false. So we have 3 returns. We return a check against the property and the value directly if it's not an array. Otherwise, we have to check each one. So if at any point we find a match, we'll return true. And if it falls all the way through here because it never found a match, then we want to return false. You should notice here that this means that this compare values function can only do OR comparisons. So if you give it, so let's go ahead and look at what we're going to do. We're going to give it an IPA string and an ALE string. Now, in our case, this is okay because it could never be both. But if you wanted to do a more complicated comparison, you wouldn't be able to, right? You couldn't even say, you couldn't do 2 properties. You couldn't say, if type is IPA and locale is domestic. Like, there's no way to do that kind of mix and match on the filter. So the filter is still pretty narrow, but it's going to address all the use cases that we have currently, so we're going to go with it for now. So that means for here, filtered beers now equals filtered beers again, the same function. And we'll do type, but instead of just a string, we'll do an array where we do IPA or ale. And that's definitely nicer than this for loop for sure, because now we can just look at this and say, all right, we're filtering the beers on type, and we want to know if anything is either an IPA or an ale. And we'll just quickly add these other 2 for lager and stout. And now our switch statement is way more readable, right? You can look at this and say, it's still a little bit repetitive in places. Maybe we could clean that up. But from where we came from, this is a huge improvement because now we can say, in the domestic case, we want to filter the locale for domestic, and so on and so forth. And this code just reads, it kind of self-documents and tells us what's going on inside of the code. So let's save this and just make absolutely sure that it works. I want to verify that for us. Domestic, imports, ales, lagers, stouts. Oh, we messed up the stout one. Oh, filtered burrs isn't going to work. So just save that again, refresh, and we'll click on stouts, and we're back to everything working the way we want. So this is a really good improvement, like I said, but it also is fragile because the function that we just wrote is very specific. It does some comparisons in here that are specific to what we need right now, but if we were to need something more complicated at any point, we'd have to rewrite these functions, and that's just not a great foundation to build on. If we want to give ourselves more power to actually be flexible with this kind of filtering, we're going to need to take advantage of something called higher order functions, which is a huge, huge part of what makes something functional. And so we're going to take a look at that in the next video.